It's 2020. A member of the American National Security Council is heading home for the day across the White House lawn when he's suddenly struck by a ringing sound and a pain in his head. He tries to stumble to his car but collapses, loses his ability to speak. He's taken to the ER. 4 years earlier, in Havana, Cuba, a young undercover CIA agent is watching TV on his bed when he hears a loud ringing sound. He thinks it's Cuban counterintelligence messing with him. He's stubborn, doesn't want to show weakness, sticks it out for 20 minutes as the pain in his head gets worse and worse, like a vice being tightened. What happened to these two men is called Havana Syndrome, a mysterious and debilitating sickness that has affected hundreds of American spies and diplomats all over the world for the past decade. What it is and what or who is causing it has been questioned and debated by doctors, intelligence agencies, and governments, with explanations from mass hallucinations to enemy adversaries to crickets. The likely truth of Havana Syndrome is almost too strange to believe, spanning secret organizations, cross-continental car races, a father and son spy dynasty, and a weapon straight out of science fiction. Havana Syndrome, you may have noticed, is named after Havana, Cuba. It's there that the first reported case occurred, at least the first case to garner any real attention. It happened to that CIA agent I mentioned earlier, who goes by the alias Adam. Adam was on his first assignment, one of many undercover intelligence agents dispatched to Havana between 2015 to 2017. Cuba and the United States have had a difficult relationship for most of the 20th century, crescendoing in the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. During that time, Cuba became close to the Soviet Union, later Russia, and China, who both saw control over the island as a way to monitor the United States, who was a mere 90 miles or so away. In President Obama's second term, he made it a priority to try and restore a diplomatic relationship with Cuba. And he did. The U.S. Embassy in Havana was reopened and once again staffed by a number of diplomats. Some of these diplomats, however, were undercover agents for the CIA, there to gather information and keep an eye on the Cubans. Cuban intelligence is no slouch. They had been trained by the Russians and eventually grew into one of the most competent intelligence agencies in the world. Cuban intelligence would leave messages for American diplomats to let them know that they were watching, from poisoning their dog, to breaking into their house and urinating on their clothes, to putting feces on their doorknobs or slashing their tires. If you were an American, enduring these things was part of the job. And so, when Adam heard a ringing sound and felt a pain in his head, he thought that's what it was. Just another escalation of the rivalry between intelligence agencies. But whatever it was much more severe than someone flattening your tires. Adam spent the rest of the night on the couch, away from the sound. But in the coming days and weeks, he would wake up, overwhelmed by it, in a pool of blood that had poured from his nose. Tasks at work that would take him 20 minutes would take him all day, and when he reviewed what he had written, it was completely incoherent. His eyesight deteriorated. Before long, he was sent back to the States for medical treatment. Adam was not alone. By June of 2018, the number of Americans in Cuba who had symptoms similar to Adam's were over 24. The responses were all over the place. Some doctors said the most likely explanation was mass psychological illness. Basically, it was all in their head. Others thought it was a neurological condition caused by a pesticide, and others still thought it was some kind of new weapon being used by the Cubans. 21 of the affected diplomats in Cuba took part in a study at the University of Pennsylvania that found their symptoms resembled concussions. Although controversial, this study was the first instance that proved that their condition was real. In 2017, the news went public, and the US had to respond, under criticism that they were no longer able to keep their agents safe in the field. By then, Obama was out, Donald Trump was president, and he immediately reversed course on building a relationship with Cuba. The United States pulled their diplomats and agents out of the country. The government subtly and overtly blamed Cuba for Havana Syndrome, and the thought was that these isolated incidents were over. But they were only beginning. Starting in 2017, U.S. intelligence personnel, their families, and sometimes their pets reported attacks in Colombia, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Australia, Poland, Taiwan, Austria, China, Georgia, and Russia, among other countries. Multiple instances have even been reported in Washington, D.C. On October 7, 2021, an American nurse, whose alias is Joy, was switching her laundry over in her house in Tbilisi, Georgia, where she was living with her husband, who was a U.S. Embassy official. She experienced a loud ringing in her left ear, as if caught by a beam of energy. She developed a strong headache immediately and ran to the bathroom to vomit. She remembered what she'd been trained to do. If something feels wrong, leave the location. So she checked her security camera and saw a black Mercedes parked outside, directly across from the laundry room. She went outside and saw a tall, well-dressed blonde man standing by the Mercedes. The two locked eyes. She took a picture of him and the car as the man got in and quickly drove off. 3 years later, she would identify the man in the photograph as Albert Averyanov, the heir to Unit 29155, the assassination and sabotage squad of Russia's intelligence agency, the GRU. Unit 29155 has been operating in secret since at least 2008, although it first became public knowledge in 2019. The unit is responsible for the attempted assassinations of Emelian Gebrev and Sergei Skripal, destabilization efforts in Moldova, an ammunition warehouse explosion in Chechnya, and a lot more. The founding commander of the unit, Andrei Averyanov, is the father of the man seen outside of Joy's house in 2020. Russia has motive to disrupt ties between the United States and Cuba and to remove intelligence agents and diplomats from active duty. But motive and operatives to carry it out doesn't prove they did it. A year-long investigation from The Insider, 60 Minutes and Der Spiegel, tracked Unit 29155 operatives around the world, starting as early as 2014, and found that members of the unit were at the locations where Havana Syndrome attacks occurred at or just before the attacks. Adam, the CIA agent mentioned earlier, is referred to as Patient Zero for Havana Syndrome, but he's likely not the first person attacked. When Adam reported his symptoms to his medical officer, the medical officer reported having a similar experience. But even years before that, another incident occurred with stark similarities. In 2014 in Frankfurt, Germany, an employee at the US consulate saw a suspicious man taking pictures of cars with US diplomat license plates. The employee confronted him. They had a brief exchange. The man taking pictures had a thick Russian accent and ran off. Weeks later, that same employee heard a ringing sound at work. An intense pressure built up in his torso and head. He became nauseous and went to the bathroom to throw up, where he fell unconscious. He was later diagnosed with a traumatic brain injury. The consulate employee identified the man he saw as Igor Gordienko, a member of Unit 29155 and the mentor to Albert Averyanov. How does the sighting of a Russian man weeks before the attack connect? Unit 29155 operatives were all over Western Europe in the dates preceding the attack. Spies work hard to obscure their travel routes, never flying directly to their destination and taking hours or sometimes days of train or car travel to mislead anyone trying to track their movements. 3 members of the unit were staying at a hotel in Geneva, about 6 hours away from Frankfurt, from October 15th to November 3rd. The consulate employee was attacked on November 4th, the first of 2 attacks in Frankfurt in 2014. In 2017, as reports of Havana Syndrome started to come out of China, Russians were found there too, taking an even more obscure route. The Silk Way, an international off-road race, was started in 2009, beginning in Russia and spanning to China, Syria, Iran, and Qatar, to name a few. The Silk Way became a tool for the GRU, a way to spread Russian influence and also transport Russians discreetly. Alexander Mishkin, who poisoned Sergei Skripal and some of his colleagues, were part of a Silk Way car crew, allowing them to disappear for a few weeks with the convoy during the period when Skripal was poisoned. A photo shows Sergei Advinko, another 29155 member, masquerading as a crew member as the Silk Way went to China in 2017, around the time of some of the first cases of Havana Syndrome in China. The web is far more complicated, much more than I can touch on in this video, but suffice to say there's evidence to suggest that members of Unit 29155 were in the locations of Havana Syndrome incidents around the world, at or shortly before the time of the attacks. The identity of the victims further support a Russian connection. In 2014, Ukraine experienced violent protests against pro-Russian forces in the country. Despite a lack of evidence, Putin still to this day blames these protests on the CIA and British intelligence. In the following year, the CIA and Ukrainian intelligence would form a key partnership, making Ukraine one of America's most important intelligence sources against Russia. Years later, between 2020 and 2021, CIA operatives who were part of the initiatives in Ukraine in 2014 and 2015 were victims of Havana Syndrome attacks in Vietnam, London, and Uzbekistan. Mark Lindsay, one of the few publicly outspoken victims of Havana Syndrome, was an ex-diplomat to Russia who studied in the country for years. And the supposed first victims, those stationed in Cuba, were part of an effort to restore relationships between the United States and Cuba, a process that would limit Russian power on the island and decrease Russia's ability to keep tabs on the United States. So we have motive, we have opportunity, but what about means? One initial idea about Havana Syndrome was that it was an acoustic weapon, since the majority of victims reported hearing a loud ringing sound at the time of the attack. That theory was dismissed. Sound cannot damage the brain, at least certainly not in a way that resembles a concussion. Among those who believed the condition was real, some experts suggest it could be the result of pulsed microwaves. Russia, it turns out, has been experimenting with the technology for years. As early as 1974, a Russian patent was issued to a military unit for an allegedly successful test of a non-lethal weapon using radio waves. In the late 80s, the Russians had developed a blueprint for a radio wave weapon, but it was huge, requiring a large dish to sit on top of a car outfitted with generators and antenna. By 2010, leaked documents suggest a portable prototype was made that could be mounted onto commercial vehicles with a range of 10 to 12 meters. This wouldn't even be the first time Russia had used microwave radiation against the United States. From 1953 to 1976, the United States Embassy in Moscow was targeted by microwaves that were used to power a listening device inside the embassy. The US government kept it quiet, in part so they could study the health effects it had on their own employees in the embassy. Officially, no adverse health effects were connected to the signal, although this claim has been disputed, and the amount of microwave radiation was significantly lower and not intended to be a weapon on its own. In late 2017, Ivan Terentiev, an engineer and R&D specialist for Russia's Ministry of Defense, was paid by the Ministry of Defense for work he had done developing a new weapon. His research had been focused on the potential capabilities of non-lethal acoustic weapons in combat activities in urban settings. Terentiev had been one of the Russians to travel to Germany and stay in Geneva in 2014. In 2019, Terentiev was promoted to a distinguished and lucrative position in the Kremlin, and the next year, one of his 29155 colleagues who traveled with him to Germany received a similar promotion. Positions not often awarded to field operatives like Terentiev, unless he had done something special worthy of a prize from Putin. Pulsed microwaves are capable of penetrating through some walls and metal barriers, fracturing membranes, damaging the sheathing that encases neurons, and breaking the blood-brain barrier, causing concussion-like symptoms and traumatic brain injuries. While suffering attacks, Havana Syndrome victims almost universally reported the symptoms stopped or significantly lessened when they put walls between themselves and the point of attack, further supporting the idea of a short-range weapon. Despite all of this, the hundreds of cases of Havana Syndrome around the world, the substantial evidence suggesting the involvement of Russia in the attacks, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence issued a report in March of 2023 stating it was very unlikely that Havana Syndrome was caused by a foreign adversary. Many victims were publicly incensed by this report. There are a few reasons why they might say that. The first, they know something significant that we don't. This is possible. It has often taken decades for the public to discover things the CIA has kept secret. But there's another more troubling and perhaps more likely possibility. Let's assume for a moment that everything I've said is completely true. Russia is behind Havana Syndrome and has been assaulting US federal employees for a decade. The United States would have to acknowledge that a nuclear power has engaged in what many would consider an act of war against them. The diplomatic implications of that are far from simple. Beyond that, the CIA would have to admit that they cannot keep their agents safe in the field. Federal intelligence agents have already quit over fear of being a victim of Havana Syndrome. How much would recruitment efforts suffer in the wake of these revelations? The United States government has handed out hefty sums to the victims of Havana Syndrome, compensation for the pain and suffering caused in the service of their country, and maybe in part to try to get them to stop talking about it. In recent years, instances of Havana Syndrome have decreased, but reports suggest an attack was carried out as recently as July of 2023. It will take time to suss out the full truth behind Havana Syndrome. But if it is proven that Russia carried out the attacks, neutralizing dozens if not hundreds of their greatest rivals, diplomats, and intelligence agents without ever being caught, it will be one of the most effective instances of sabotage in history. Admitting to that at the moment is too bitter a pill for the United States to swallow. And so federal employees around the world would continue doing their dishes, changing over their laundry, or watching a show in their bedroom, hoping that ringing sound they hear is just crickets and not the Kremlin.